Trumas per Gimel Mishnah Aleph. Hatarim kishus v'nimtzas mara. If someone separated cucumber as truma for other cucumbers, and it's later found to be bitter. Avatiach v'nimtzas haruach. If one separated a melon as truma for other melons, and it's later found to be spoiled, truma v'yachzav v'yitraim. It's valid truma, but he must separate truma again. In general, if someone designated shvacha produce, inferior produce as truma for superior produce, although he should not have done so, the truma is good, b'di'evet. However, bitter cucumbers and spoiled melons are worse than other inferior produce because they are not eaten. Therefore, designating bitter cucumbers for other cucumbers or spoiled melons for other melons is an ineffective designation. It is like designating tameh produce as truma for tar produce, which is midrabanan no good, since truma that is tameh may not be eaten. In fact, the Chachamim were stricter in our Mishnah's case than where one designated tameh produce as truma for tar produce. There they ruled that if the designation was made by mistake, the person didn't know that the produce was tameh, and the truma is good, and he doesn't have to separate truma again. But here they paskin that even if the designation was made by mistake, he didn't know the cucumber was bitter, or that the watermelon was spoiled, he must separate truma again. The reason for the difference is that there the person had no way of knowing that the produce was tameh. So you can't blame him. The Chachamim required nothing of him. Here, though, the person should have first tasted the produce in order to determine whether it was fully edible. Since he failed to do so, the Chachamim made him separate a second truma. Seemingly, he could not have tasted the produce before he designated it as truma, since at the time it was still tevel. One solution is that he could have cut off a small part of the cucumber or watermelon and separated trumas and maises from that part, and then he would be allowed to eat from the rest. If someone separates a barrel of wine as truma for other wine and it's later found to be vinegar, for example, if a person has 50 barrels of wine and wants to separate a 50th as truma, say he designated one barrel as truma for all the others, he discovered afterwards that the wine in the designated barrel has turned into vinegar. If it is now known that the liquid in the barrel was already vinegar before he separated it as truma, it's not valid truma because wine and vinegar are regarded as different types of produce, so truma cannot be separated from one for the other. But if it is now known that it soured only after he separated it as truma, it's valid truma because it was still wine, b'shas the hafrasha at the time that he separated. V'im safik, if there's a doubt as to whether when it became vinegar, truma, it's good truma because it might have been wine when it was separated. But he must separate truma again because on the other hand, it might have been vinegar at the time. In such a case, we would say safik deraisa lechumra. Accordingly, since the designation was possibly valid, the separated portion is subject to the chumras of truma. For example, may not be eaten by a kohanim. On the other hand, since the designation was no good, the entire crop must be treated with the stringencies of tevel and may not be eaten by anyone until the second portion of truma is designated. The second portion is somewhat smaller than the first because it's separated only on behalf of the barrels that remain after the first barrel was separated. Although the first portion might be tevel if it was vinegar, and its designation as truma was ineffective, the owner is not obligated to take off meiser from that portion itself. Since it must go to a kohen in any case, the Chachamim imposed a meiser obligation on the kohen. For example, if the owner originally had 50 barrels of wine and designated one of them as truma, he then designates a 50th of the remaining 49 barrels, which is 49 out of 50 of a single barrel. Only one of the two portions is actual truma. If the first portion was wine when it was separated, the designation was effective, and that is the real truma. But if it was vinegar at the time, the designation was not effective, and the second portion is the real truma. Therefore, although the owner is forbidden to eat both portions because either might be truma, he need give only one to a kohen for free because the kohen does not have a monetary right for both. Furthermore, he may give the kohen the smaller portion because matters of monetary ownership are decided according to the halacha. The burden of proof rests on the one who's trying to take from the other. In our case, the burden of proof rests on the kohen who's claiming the truma from the owner. Since the kohen cannot prove that the first larger portion is the actual truma, he must settle for the second smaller one. In theory, after giving the small portion to the kohen, the owner could keep the larger one for himself, but since he cannot use it in any case, for it might be truma, he may sell it to a kohen. If the first portion falls onto ordinary produce by itself, it does not make the mixture meduma, which is a forbidden mixture of truma and ordinary produce. Minat Torah, if a forbidden food such as truma gets mixed with a larger amount of permitted food of the same type, the forbidden food is batal and the entire mixture is mutter. This is the halacha bittul b'roiv, nullification in a majority. However, mixtures of truma and chulin are midrabanon osir unless the amount of chulin in the mixture is at least 100 times more than the amount of truma. A rabbinical forbidden mixture of truma and chulin is called meduma. The Mishnah's case, though, where it's possible that the truma portion is not truma, the halacha of meduma does not apply because of safek d'rabbanan l'kula. Thus, instead of applying the more stringent rabbinic law, we follow the din haTorah that the mixture is permitted as long as there's a simple majority of chulin. The Mishnah says that the vinegar portion fell by itself, which consists of wine, and without the second portion, which consists of wine. And a non-kahanim who eat the first portion by mistake, for example, if he doesn't realize that it's truma, are not obligated to pay a chaimesh for it. Ordinarily, a non-kayan who commits a sin of eating truma by mistake must pay the kayan with the produce that's worth the principal, the karen, plus a chaimesh, a quarter of the principal, which is a fifth of the final total. The produce itself becomes truma. The Mishnah teaches that if a non-kayan eats something that might be truma, he's mechuyev to pay only the karen and not the chaimesh. The reason for this halacha is that the zar, the non-kayan, is not forgiven for his sin of eating truma by mistake unless he separates the karen and designates it as truma. The punishment of a chaimesh, however, is not required for the kapara. It's just a monetary fine that the Torah imposes for eating truma. Again, it's before in the Gemara Baba Kama that it's not a kanas, it has a din of mammon. Monetary fines are not imposed in cases of doubt. In fact, to gain forgiveness, it's enough to separate the karen, although he must then give it to the kohen whose truma he ate. That is not for the purpose of forgiveness, but only to compensate the kohen for the monetary loss. Mishnah Beis. V'chein hashniya. And the same is true of the second barrel. It doesn't make the other produce meduma, and eating it does not carry the chiyuv of chaimesh. Mishnah Beis. The Mishnah continues with the discussion of the case of the previous Mishnah, where two portions, one of wine and one was vinegar, was designated as truma, but only one of them is actually truma, and we don't know which one's which. So the Mishnah elaborates on what happens if one or both of the portions fall into chulin. So if the liquid in one of the barrels fell into chulin, does not make the chulin forbidden meduma mixture. If the liquid in the second barrel fell into a different place, into a different container of chulin, it does not make the chulin forbidden meduma mixture. These halachas are apparently the same as those taught at the end of the previous mission. They repeat here to teach that if both of the two portions of truma fell into different containers of chulin, both mixtures are permitted. It could have been thought that both mixtures are forbidden because one of them certainly contains real truma. Our Mishnah teaches this is not so because we look at each mixture by itself. We say that since each one by itself is permitted, because each one contains questionable truma, both are going to be mutter. But if the liquids in both of them fell into one place, the same container of chulin, they make the chulin a forbidden meduma mixture with the amount of truma in the mixture calculated according to the smaller of the two portions. Since both portions fell into the chulin, one of them is definitely truma, the mixture becomes meduma. However, in order for the mixture to be permitted to non-kehan, we don't require 100 times more chulin than both portions together. Only one portion is real truma. Furthermore, it's enough for the chulin to be 100 times greater than the smaller portion because we rule leniently with respect to doubts that concern dinei d'rabbanan. Even when a mixture of truma and chulin is mutter, the kohen does not lose his share of truma. One must remove an amount from the mixture equal to the truma that fell in and give it to a kohen. In our case, when both portions fell into chulin, if the mixture is permitted because chulin is at least 100 times more than the smaller portion, one removes an amount equal to both portions and gives it to a kohen. He may charge the kohen the price of the amount corresponding to the larger portion. Mishnah Gimel. We learned in the first Mishnah of the Masechta that one cannot separate truma from someone else's produce without the owner's permission. The Mishnah discusses a situation where two people share ownership of produce, and one of them separates truma for all of it without the other person's knowledge. His separation certainly works for his own share of the produce. The question is whether it works for his partner's share as well. In a case where two partners separated truma for all of their jointly owned produce, one after the other. For example, Reuven and Shimon own 50 sah of wheat together. Reuven designated a sah of the wheat as truma for the other 49 sah. Afterwards, Shimon, unaware that Reuven had already separated truma, designated another sah as truma. So Rabbi Kiva says, Truma shneim truma, both of their trumas are valid. That is, the truma designation by each person is effective for his own share, though not for his partner's share, since the partner wanted to separate truma himself for the portion that he owns. According to Rekiva, we assume that each partner wants to separate truma for his own share and doesn't want the other partner to do so for him. Therefore, only half of the sah separated by Ruvain is truma for his own chelik, and the other half sah is not truma at all. Similarly, when Shimon separates the sah's truma, half is truma for his own share, and the other half is not truma. Within the sah separated by each partner, it's impossible to identify which half is truma and which is chul, and so the entire mixture is forbidden to non-kehanim. Both sahs are therefore given to a kohen. The kohen gets half of each sah for free and pays for the other half. He then separates the truma and ma'asos that are needed for the two half sahs. Since half of each sah is not truma but ordinary tevel, he may eat them. The Chachamim say trumas harishin truma. The truma of the first partner is valid for all of the produce, so the truma designation by the second partner is meaningless. The Chachamim maintain that each partner presumably does not object to having the other partner separate truma for the entire crop. For example, Shimon separated truma after Reuven only because he didn't know that Reuven had already done so. Therefore, Reuven's designation works not only for his share of the produce, but also for Shimon's share, and the sah Reuven designated is entirely truma. Shimon's designation is thus entirely worthless, since the produce for which it was designated was already exempt from the truma obligation. Rabbi Yossi says, Imtaram Harishon Kashir, if the first partner separated the standard amount of truma for both of the chalakim of both shotvim, meaning a 50th of all the produce is truma for all the produce, so then ain't trumas hasheni truma, and the truma of the second partner is not truma at all, like the Chacham said. However, if the first partner did not separate the standard measure of truma, meaning he separated less than a 50th of all the produce, we can assume that the second partner would not want that portion to be the truma for his share, because he wants to give the standard measure. So then trumas hasheni truma. So in this case, then the Chachamim agree that the first partner's truma is valid only for his own share, and the truma of the second partner is valid for his share. Mishnah Dalet. In what case are the words Rabbi Kiva stated, namely, that the truma designation by one partner does not work for the share of the other partner, b'shalei diber. This halacha applies only where the first partner, the first shutif, did not speak to his partner and gets permission to separate truma for his share. But if one gives permission to his partner, even to a member of his household, or even to his servant or his maidservant, whether they are Jewish or not, meaning even if it's Eved Kanani or Shifchei Kanainis, to separate truma, the portion separated by the appointed person is valid truma. Rabbi Kiva holds that one partner is presumably unwilling to have the other separate truma for his chelik. If he does give permission, however, the truma separated by the partner is valid. Giving permission works not only for his partner who owns some of the produce, but even for a household member who does not own any of it. Additionally, even Eved Kanani or Shifchei Kananis can separate truma for the bailam, for the owner. Although goyim are generally unable to separate truma from a yid's produce, like we learned in the first Mishnah, Eved Kananis are different because they have the status of yidden to some extent, insofar as they're mechuyev in certain mitzvahs. In fact, it's possible for the owner to have any Jewish adult separate truma on his behalf. The Mishnah specifies one's family members and his servants because in their case it's not necessary to directly instruct them to separate truma. You need only suggest it indirectly, for example, by saying, if you want, you can separate truma. Bitel, if he canceled the permission that he gave, the halacha is as follows. Imach loy taram bitel, if he canceled the permission before the other person separated the truma, ein truma is a truma. His truma is not valid. But if he canceled the permission after the other person already separated his truma, his truma is valid. Workers do not have permission to separate truma for their employer's produce. We don't presume that since he hired them to work with his produce, he gives them permission to separate truma from it. Except for workers who are chaverim, who are people who are careful to avoid becoming tameh, who are hired by Nama'ara to transmit tumah to what he touches, to step on the grapes in his wine press, in which case it's clear that he wants them to separate his truma for him so that the truma doesn't become tameh. We spoke about this in the Mai, that this is what they would do sometimes. Shehin metamin asagas miyad, and they should separate the truma when they start stepping on the grapes, because the owner will touch and transmit tumah to the wine press immediately afterwards, and it will be too late to separate truma that's tahor. An Amoritz is an uneducated person who is ignorant of the laws of Tara and does not try to keep himself tahor. The Chachamim were geyser that anything touched by an Amoritz is tameh. However, since this Am Ha'aretz owner went out of his way to hire chaverim who are usually tahor to press his grapes rather than press them himself, or hire other Am Ha'aretz to press them, He shows that he wants his workers to separate truma for him so that the produce will not become tamei. Although he isn't Ama'aret, he knows that if the grapes or wine becomes tamei, the truma separated from them would also be tamei, which is not ideal. In this case, therefore, the workers can indeed separate truma without the owner's stated permission because it's clear that he wants them to do so. The workers should set aside a portion of the juice soon after they started treading on the grapes, specifically after they have walked in one direction across the wine press, then walked in the perpendicular direction, so that they have crisscrossed the wine press. However, they may not actually designate it as truma at this point because most of the grapes have not yet been processed and forbidden to designate truma from processed produce such as juice for unprocessed produce such as grapes. Rather, they set the portion aside and later, after all the grapes have been pressed, they designate it as truma. The reason for setting it aside so early on is that the Amaret's owner assumes that the workers actually designate truma at this time, so he then feels free to touch the juice in the wine press, which would make all of it tamei. So to prevent the juice from becoming tamei before truma can be taken, the workers remove some tahor juice from the wine press before their owner touches it, and they later designate that portion as truma. When they do in fact designate the separated juice as truma, the rest of the juice may very well already be tamei because the owner had touched it. Although one should not separate truma that's tahor for produce that is tamei, here it's mutter because there's no other option, there's no other way to do it. The Mishnah specifies a wine press in contrast to an olive press. The difference is that the owner is likely to touch the juice in a wine press in order to taste it. Thus, the workers must set aside some tahor juice before he does so. There's little danger, however, of the owner touching the oil in an olive press, since oil is not usually tasted, as is explained in Kama places, that oil has a different status than grape juice altogether. Mishnah Hey. Ha'omer trumas hakriza b'seichai. If one says that the truma of this pile is inside it, masreisa b'seichai, and he says the maisers are inside it, trumas maisers b'seichai, or he says the trumas maiser of this pile is inside it, the halacha is, Reb Shimon says kara shem. He has made a binding declaration, that is, since he said that the truma or maiser will come from a specific part of the pile inside the pile, as opposed to the outside of the pile, his statement is binding, and he may later separate truma only from inside the pile and not from the outer layer or anywhere else. The Torah describes truma as reishis degoncha tireshcha v'tzarecha, the first of your grain, wine, and oil. The term first implies an initial portion which is distinct from the remainder. Thus, in order to be good, a truma designation must clearly distinguish between the portion that's truma and the remaining produce. Obviously, if one physically removes a portion from a pile of produce and designates an entire portion as truma, both the truma portion and the remainder are clearly defined. Moreover, even if one simply says that a particular portion of the produce is truma without removing it from the pile, he has defined the portion that he wants, and so it becomes truma. Although the pasuk speaks of truma, the halacha applies to maasros as well. A statement of the type cited in our Mishnah, the truma of this pile is inside it, is not specific enough to actually designate truma. Nevertheless, since it mentions only the inner part of the pile, which excludes the outside layer, it's clearly eliminating the possibility of separating truma from the outside layer. This is enough for the statement to be binding, and that truma can later be separated only from the inner part of the pile, not from the outer layer or any other source. The Chachamim say, his declaration is not binding until he says something more specific, such as the truma of the pile is on the north side or on the south side. He's then limited to designating the truma from the side of the pile that he named. The Chachamim agree that the statement, the truma of this pile is inside it, refers only to the inner part of the pile and excludes the outer layer. But since he didn't specify a particular section of the pile, it's as though he said nothing. He can later designate truma from anywhere in the pile, or even from a different place altogether. However, if he said the truma of this pile is on its northern side, for example, which is more specific, his statement is legally effective, and truma can later be separated only from the northern side of the pile. Rabbi Elazar Chisma says, Ha'omer trumas hakri mimenu alav kara shem. If one says the truma of this pile is to be taken from it for the rest of it, kara shem, he has made a binding declaration. According to this Tana, it's not necessary to specify any particular part of the pile. When one says the truma of the pile is to be taken from it for the rest of it, he includes the entire pile and does not exclude any of it. Nevertheless, Rabbi Elazar Chisma holds that the statement is effective, and truma cannot be separated from a different pile. Unlike Reb Shimon the Chachamim, he holds that such a statement has legal force, even though it does not draw any distinction between one part of the pile and another. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, "Ha'omer iser meiser zeh osei trumas meiser olav." If one says a tenth of this meiser rishon is hereby made trumas meiser for it, kara shem, he has made a binding declaration. So according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, Trumas Meiser can be designated only from Meiser Rishon and not from ordinary tevel. He also holds that there's no need to specify part of the pile. Rather, a simple reference to a tenth, which could be anywhere in the pile, is enough. So, Kumt says there's two nekudas where Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov and Reb Shimon argue about. Number one, Reb Shimon implied that even part of ordinary tevel can be designated as the portion from which Trumas Meiser will later be separated, whereas Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that one must separate Meiser Rishon, and only then can Trumas Meiser be designated from the Meiser Rishon. And number two, according to Reb Shimon and the Chachamim, it's necessary to define that part of the pile for which the Truma or Meiser will be separated, while Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov holds that no specification is needed. In his view, it's enough to say that any tenth of the Meiser Rishon will become Trumas Meiser. In this respect, Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov agrees with Reb Eliezer Chismo, who rules that the specification of the part of the pile which you're taking Trumas or Meiser from is not required. Mishnah Vav. Hamakdim Truma Labikurim. The portion separated from produce must be designated in this specific order. Bikurim. Bikurim are the first fruits that ripen each year of the 7 species of produce which Eretz Yisrael has praised, the Shivas Haminim, which is Chitim, Sa'irem, Gefen, Te'ina, Verimain, Zeishemen, and Zvash. The owner must bring his Bikurim to the Beis HaMikdash, where he performs a specific ritual with them and gives them to the Kayim. So first is Bikurim. Second is Truma Gedayla. Third is Meiser Rishon. Fourth is Meiser Sheni or Meiser Ani, depending on the year. The Mekar for this order are presented in the next Mishnah from the Torah. Trumas Meiser is not included in the sequence because its separation is not the responsibility of the original owner of the produce, but of the Levi to whom the Meiser Rishon is given. And after Meiser Sheni, and Meiser Sheni would be the last one. So the Mishnah is going to discuss what happened if someone didn't follow the order. So Makdim Truma La Bikurim, someone designated Truma before Bikurim, or Meiser Rishon La Truma, or if he designated Meiser Rishon before Truma Gedayla, or Meiser Sheni La Rishon, or he designated Meiser Sheni before Meiser Rishon. Aval Pishu Ever B'Leisa say, even though he's over in a Leisa say, Masha also what he did is done, and it's good Truma, it's good Meiser. You don't have to take off Truma or Meiser again. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, "Maleoscha v'demachol leisa acher." Do not delay your bikurim or your truma. That is, you shall not designate these portions too late. That is, after the correct position in the order. The same would be true of Meiser Rishon. The word Maleoscha in the pasuk literally means your fullness portion. This refers to bikurim, which are the first fruits of the crop to become full, to ripen. The word demacha means your liquid portion. It's used in reference to truma as a way to contrast it with bikurim, since truma for grapes and olives can always be taken from liquid, that's from wine and oil, whereas bikurim must usually be brought in the solid form, either by olives or the grapes themselves. The pasuk's reference to truma includes Meiser Rishon because Meiser Rishon contains trumas meiser, which is a type of truma. Thus, the pasuk prohibits delaying any of these portions, designating it later in the sequence that it should be. The pasuk does not refer to Meiser Sheni or Meiser Ani, for since this is the last portion to be separated, its designation cannot be delayed. In fact, one who separates portions out of the required sequence violates not only the negative commandment, whose source is presented in the Mishnah, but also the positive commandment to follow the correct order, whose sources are presented in the next Mishnah. And now we shall see the next Mishnah, Mishnah Zayin. The Mishnah explains how we know that the portions must be separated in the order set forth in the previous Mishnah. First Bikurim, second Truma, third Meiser Rishon, fourth Meiser Sheni, or Meiser Ani. Where do we know that Bikurim should be separated before Truma? Zakari Truma Verashis, Zakari Truma Verashis. After all, this Bikurim is called by the Torah Truma and first, and that Truma is also called Truma and first by the Torah. So what's the difference between them? The Torah describes Bikurim as Trumas Yodecha, the Truma of your hand, and as Rashis. However, these sources do not suffice to teach that Bikurim comes first, because the Torah uses the same terms with respect to Truma as well. Truma is called Truma Samai Trumas, and it's described as Rashis Degancha, the first of your grain. So why should Bikurim come first? Bikurim, Shehim Bikurim Lakol. Nevertheless, Bikurim should be separated first because their very name Bikurim implies that they are the first ones of all. The Torah uses the word Bikurim, first ones, to teach that they should be designated before all other portions, meaning before any other matanos. Utruma Larishon, and Truma comes before Meiser Rishon Shehi Rashis, because Truma is called Rashis in the Torah and Meiser Rishon is not. The word Truma appears not only regarding Truma, but also regarding Meiser Rishon. However, the Torah says Rishon or Rashis only in reference to Truma. Ma'aser Rishon L'Sheni, Ma'aser Rishon comes before Ma'aser Sheni, Sheish Bereishis, because Ma'aser Rishon contains Truma's Ma'aser, which can be called first, can also be referred to as Reishis because it's also a form of Truma. Likewise, in years when Ma'aser Ani is separated, Ma'aser Rishon must be designated before it as well. Mishnah Ches, Hamiskaven Lemer Truma V'Amar Ma'aser. The Mishnah is going to discuss what happens if someone wanted to declare part of his produce Truma or Ma'aser, but he misspoke and declared a different type of Ma'aser from which he had intended. Along with that, the Mishnah addresses some similar cases in which someone wanted to make a declaration that would change the status of something, but his words did not match what he had in mind. So, if someone separated a portion from his crop and intended to say it's Truma, but by mistake, he mistakenly said Ma'aser v'Amar Truma, or if he intended to say Ma'aser but mistakenly said Truma, Oilav Amar Shlamim, if someone wanted to bring an animal as a carbon and intended to say Oilav but mistakenly said Shlamim v'Amar Oila, or he intended to say Shlamim but mistakenly said Oila, she'eni nichnas l'bayis v'Amar lo zeh, or if someone intended to say, I swear that I will not enter this house, referring to a particular house, but mistakenly said this house, referring to a different house, she'eni nana lo zeh v'Amar lo zeh, or if someone intended to say, I will not have benefit from this property of this person, but mistakenly said, this person, referring to someone else, lo yamar klum, in all of these cases he has said nothing, meaning nothing happened. Ad she'yiyu piv v'li by shaven, because a statement is not legally binding unless one's mouth and one's mind are the same, which means that the words that come out of one's mouth must be consistent with the thoughts in his mind. If a person has one thing in mind but says something else, his statement has no legal force. There seems to be a contradiction between two psukim that concern donating items to the Beis Hamikdash. On the one hand, the pasuk says, "Moitzis v'secha tishma ve'osisa," you shall observe and perform that which is expressed by your lips, which implies that a dedication is affected by speech. But on the other hand, the Torah refers to those who dedicated items to the Mishkan as Kol Nadiv Leiv, everyone whose heart motivated him, which implies that they had dedicated the items in their hearts, which means in their minds without speech. The answer is that a statement made with one's mouth is legally binding only if it's consistent with the thoughts in one's mind. If one intended to say the words that came out of his mouth, his statement is effective, but if he intended to say other words, it is as though he has said nothing. Although this halacha was stated in regard to dedicating items to the Beis Hamikdash, it also applies to other areas in halacha, such as the halachas mentioned in our Mishnah, Trumas HaMaisris, Karbanis, Shvua, and Eder. Many authorities hold that one can designate Trumas HaMaisris by means of thoughts alone without saying anything. However, this works only if he intended to use thoughts alone. If he wanted to make the designation with speech, as in our Mishnah's cases, it's not valid unless his words match his thoughts. Mishnah Tes, the final Mishnah of this parak. However, Kechavim v'Akusi, a guy or a Kusi. The Kusim were a group of people who settled in Eretz Yisrael towards the end of the first Beis Hamikdash, where when they were attacked by lions, they converted to Yiddishkeit in the hope that this would save them. But after their gerus, they returned to many of their earlier beliefs and practices. There's machlekes Tana on whether their conversion was sincere and therefore valid, or whether it was not sincere. The Tana of our Mishnah, who puts together Kusim with Goyim, clearly holds that their conversion was not valid. Happens to be that later they found out that they were taka oivdei avodah zarah, so then they took on a din with Goyim. Masech the Kusim deals with this specific issue. So Trumas and Truma, their Truma that they separate from their own produce is valid Truma. U'ma'aser and Ma'aser, their Ma'aser that they separate from their own produce are Ma'aser. Although a Goy is not mechuyev to keep the halachas of the Torah except for the Shev Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, if he designates Trumas and Ma'aser, the designation is effective. Thus his Truma may not be eaten by a Yid unless he's a Kohen, and his Ma'aser is Tevel until Trumas Ma'aser separated from it, and his Ma'aser Sheni may not be eaten by a Yid except in Yerushalayim or after he was paided. The fact that a Goy can designate Trumas and Ma'aser is learned from his ability that he's able to be Makdish and be Makrav Karbonis, which we'll see about in a minute. The Mishnah must be referring to a guy who separated Trumas and Ma'aser from his own produce, because we learned in the beginning of the Masechta that Goyim cannot take off Ma'aser from the produce of a Yid. Although a Goy has the legal ability to designate Truma, as we learn here, he's unable to do so for a Yid, because a Goy cannot serve as a Shliach of a Yid. According to this Mishnah, a Goy's ownership of the land in Eretz Yisrael does not remove its Kedusha. Right? It's not Mafkiya Mi'ad Ma'aser. Thus, the produce grown there is Tevel and subject to all the halachas of Trumas and Ma'asers. Although the Goy himself has no chiyuv to observe these laws, the land is kadosh, and its produce must be treated as produce of Eretz Yisrael. Hektish and hektish. If they consecrated an animal as a korban, it's a valid hektish. An animal that a guy designates may be offered on the mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash. It's learned out from the pasuk Ish mi Beis Yisrael umin hager bi Yisrael she'akrav karbonoi. Any man of the house of Israel and of the converts among Israel who will bring his offering. By repeating the word ish, the pasuk teaches that goyim too can bring makdish behemoths and have them brought as karbonos in the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ein lo yvikachavim kerem revai." The produce of a goy is not subject to the halachas of neter revai. Revai refers to the fruits that grow in the fourth year of a tree's existence. The fruits of the first 3 years are known as arla, and no benefit may be had from them. The fruits of the fourth year are permitted, but are kadosh. They may be eaten in Yerushalayim, or be paid on Maisa, which is then taken to Yerushalayim, and used to purchase food, and it's eaten there. The halacha of arla applies to all fruit trees. However, there's machlekes in the Gemara, and brachas on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, as to whether the halacha of Ravai also applies to all fruit trees, or only to vineyards. The numerous Mishnayos, including our Mishnah, refers to Ravai as Kerem Ravai, the Ravai of a vineyard, and that those who maintain that halacha applies to all fruit trees hold that the text of the Mishnah should read Neter Ravai, which would be any tree. So Rabbi Yehuda Aimer Ein Lo Evikechav in Kerem Ravai. Rabbi Yehuda cannot be referring to Eretz Yisrael proper because he rules elsewhere that land owned by a goy in Eretz Yisrael is fully kadosh. Rather, he's referring to the land of Syria, a country to the north of Eretz Yisrael, which was conquered by David HaMelech. In some respects, Midrabanon, Syria has dinim of Eretz Yisrael, and in some respects, it's viewed as chutz la'aretz. Rabbi Yehuda holds the land owned by a goy in Syria is not subject to the laws of Eretz Yisrael and is therefore parted from Ravai. But the Chachamim say that the land of a goy is mechuyev in Ravai. According to the Chacham, the produce of Syria, whether it's owned by a Yid or by a goy, is subject to the laws of Ravai because they hold that the Dinei HaTorah of Ravai are not limited to Eretz Yisrael and they apply in Chutz La'aretz as well. Truma ha'ovet kechav midamas. If the truma of a goy falls into ordinary produce, it makes a mixture meduma, a forbidden mixture of truma and chulin. And non-kaihanim are obligated to pay the extra fifth for the sin of eating it by mistake, without realizing that it's truma. A goy's truma is good midiraisa and is therefore treated like regular truma in every respect. Reb Shimon Paiter, but Reb Shimon exempts one who ate it by mistake from having to pay a chaimish, though he agrees that it would make ordinary produce meduma. According to Reb Shimon, a goy's truma is recognized only under the dinei d'Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan did not impose the penalty of the chaimish in his case. The chaimish is treated more leniently because it's not required to gain forgiveness. It's just mammon. Like the previous Tana, as well as the first Tana of this mission, Reb Shimon holds that the land owned by a goy in Eretz Yisrael is fully kadosh, and its produce is subject to the laws of Trumas and Maisos. However, Reb Shimon maintains that if a goy completes the processing of the produce, he removes it from the chiyuv of Maisos Midaraisa. Such produce requiring Maiser only under rabbinical law.